Hi y'all and welcome back. Obviously I've been busy in recent months, whoops. But one of the many things I did during that time was take my kids to a couple national battlefield parks relating to the American Revolution. I like taking them to different national parks so they can earn junior ranger badges, which they find really fun. And I usually just kind of sit back and let them learn from the battlefield's materials rather than trying to tell the story myself. I'm trying to be there as a mom, not as a history major. But one of these recent trips, there was a comment from a park ranger that just got under my skin. And it's not that they meant any harm, but it reflects a common assumption about colonial America. And this park ranger, in talking to my kids, mentioned how few people in the colonial era were literate. And at this point, I did actually say something. The whole master's in history hat thing, it just kind of had a mind of its own. I couldn't control it. So I just kind of gently mentioned that the literacy rate was actually much higher than is often assumed. But the ranger just kind of doubled down by saying that far fewer people were literate back then than they are now. Now, when we use terms like few or most, it's definitely subjective. Maybe what the park ranger meant to convey isn't quite as extreme as how it sounded. But I thought it would be an interesting topic for us to discuss. And please let me know in a comment below, what did you believe about colonial literacy before this video? Especially if you find something I mentioned in this video surprising. I want to hear about it. But let's dive in. First, there is a difference in terminology that we need to talk about. What does literacy mean in the 21st century compared to the 18th century? I think it's fairly safe to say that in the modern day, we think of literacy as the ability to read, right? In years past, though, it meant way more than that. Colonists generally considered literacy to entail education overall, everything, not limited to the ability to read. So if we read something, like written historically, where they talk about literacy, they're not going to mean the same thing that we mean. Reading was taught before writing, not at the same time. So there are some people, perhaps many people, who could read, but they couldn't write. If we aren't careful, we could end up comparing apples to oranges. So I'm going to do my best here. Let's summarize the state of modern literacy before we continue. And that's generally specific to the ability to read. Research conducted by the U.S. Department of Education found that 22% of Americans aged 16 to 74 are at or below what they call level 1 literacy. That means that this person might be able to read short texts, maybe, or fill out a brief form with their information. But this 22%, it also includes people who cannot read at all. 32% of Americans are at level 2 literacy, meaning they are nearly proficient but can only draw simple inferences. Only 46% of the country, still talking ages 16 to 74, are actually considered to be proficient readers in the modern day. Let's keep that in mind, but return to the topic of colonial literacy. Colonists engaged in literacy, different than the average modern American, where the modern American tends to read in isolation, just kind of like sitting in our corner reading a book. The colonists, they would read together as a social activity. Not only did they read the material out loud, but then they discussed it and they analyzed it together. Kind of like what I've been trying to do with some of the colonial pamphlets. It's not enough to just read it. We need to talk about it, talk about what it means. In terms of actual literacy rates, historians rely on what is called signature literacy. The belief is that this corresponds with a mid-range of literacy ability. So let's assume, for the sake of argument, that it is similar to being at level 2 or above literacy as categorized by the Department of Education. Remember that level 2 is almost proficient, but generally limited to simple inferences. All right? Using that comparison, and also, remember, writing was something that was taught after reading. So if someone had signature literacy, that indicates they finished the reading part of their education, right? So using that comparison, let's look at some numbers. I'm going to focus on available colonial stats for around the time of the American Revolution. I tried to use a mix of rural and urban statistics from what was available, but let's consider this a rough comparison, okay? Unfortunately, these stats are for male colonists, as that is what there's more research covering, and more on that in a second. I combined the level 2 and higher numbers from the Department of Education's data for a roughly 78% literacy rate in the modern day America. Let's compare. Starting in the northern colonies, we see Boston was at 82% and rural New England at 78%. Now, in the past, I've heard some claim that New England cared more about education than the rest of the colonies because of their Puritan ideals, and that other areas weren't as literate. But let's take a look and see what the data shows. New York City was at 87.3%, Philadelphia at 81.6%. But then these are still cities in the north, right? If we turn to rural areas in the south, well, they're bound to be largely illiterate, right? Rural Maryland was at 80%. Rural Virginia at 68%. Elizabeth City, a county in the prosperous Tidewater region of Virginia, at an astounding 91%. And then back to rural North Carolina at 79%. Now, let's go back and talk about women for a second. A graph in another source, which included signature literacy among women, reported rates ranging from 40 to 90% at a similar time in these same colonies, though those are likely from considerably smaller data sets. That's kind of the problem. They just didn't have as many opportunities to prove their literacy in official documents and give us more reliable numbers. Signature literacy also requires that they study long enough to learn to write. I've mentioned this a couple times, but remember, reading was learned first, then writing. So even if the signature literacy rate among women isn't as good, there's still a good chance that they could read. And literacy is what we're talking about, right? It's entirely possible that a higher percentage were capable of just reading. And that's men and women. It could have been a higher percentage. English servants and German immigrants also had a reasonably high literacy rate. Obviously, I'm omitting significant populations from this data. I'm not including African slaves. I'm not including American Indian populations. If we look there, then certainly the statistics are going to look quite different. The thing is, when the park ranger made his comment about literacy rates, I think it's fair to say he wasn't talking about those populations. He was specifically talking about the white male revolutionaries who wanted to win their independence from Great Britain. And luckily, that is the group that we have the most data on, right? As it happens, colonists were, on average, more literate than most European countries at the time. It's amazing, isn't it? They valued education, not just in New England, all the colonies. They valued education. And their reading comprehension was likely on point, given the social emphasis on group reading and discussion. So what do you think? Is this surprising for you or not? Also, are you interested in hearing more about the topic of literacy in colonial America? Because there are a few other related things that I could talk about if it's of interest. But like I said at the beginning of this video, I'm really interested in hearing what you thought the colonial literacy rate was, and if the numbers that I've shown you in this video were surprising at all. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.